Alrighty, so today we're going to talk about fieldwork and ethnographic methods. This will be the first part of this. Later as we get down near the end, we'll have more lectures on more specifics on methods, but this is going to lay out the foundation. Some of the stuff will be a little repetitive. Some of the stuff I want to keep saying over and over so that we have it. So I apologize if you go, wait a minute, we already did that slide. Well, we may have already done that slide, but different lectures, so we're okay. So fieldwork, of course, originates, it replaces what we used to do, the armchair anthropology, where we sat in a room like my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was a museum curator up in Washington State. And he would sit in his office, and members of the local tribes would come in, tell them stories, leave them totem poles, some of which went to the museum, some of which went into the homes. So I grew up with all these different sizes, little ones, big ones. Stuff that he used to get from the leaders of the tribes around Puyallup and Tacoma, that area, Seattle. And he was an armchair anthropologist. He sat in his museum, people brought him stuff, told him stories, and he put the stuff together. At the end of the 19th century, Franz Boas, who's the founder of American anthropology, kind of pulls us away from that and says, you know what, we got to go into the field. We have to have first-hand experience. And he cites earlier examples of that. That's people that have done it, people that have done the armchair, and really goes through and explains that in order to understand it, you must experience it. And a number of you that are turning in your observation proposals are still not grasping the idea that what you're observing is the culture or the society of what it is you're observing. Following a person as they do their job, where they're going and seeing one person here and one person there and one person there, that might be helpful for you to know what your future career is going to look like, but that's not participatory observation. Even those of you that are crim majors that are asking about doing a ride-along, I will reluctantly approve that once you show me that you have the validation that you can actually do it, because there will be, you have to aggregate all of the encounters. So, you know, what you're wanting to observe is groups. If you're observing one person or one person and just a one-on-one thing, you're really not observing culture or society. You're really not watching the interactions, the power struggles, the hierarchy, the interactions, the courtesies, the language, the use of language, all of that stuff. You're not really able to do that. And so you need to have groups bigger than two. And, you know. So Franz Boas actually goes out into the field, and he spends almost a year in the Canadian Arctic observing Inuit. Now, all Inuit are Eskimos, but not all Eskimos are Inuit. They are not interchangeable. An Inuit is a tribe within what we refer to as the Eskimos. The second major figure of participatory observation, of course, is Branislaw Malinowski. He goes to the Trobriand Islands. I have owned his ethnography since I think I was 18. I have to admit, I've never read it. It's one of the most famous and popular ethnographies ever, but most of us don't read the ethnography because he wrote a second book at the same time. It was kind of the How I Do Things. It was Reflections on Fieldwork in the Trobriand Islands. And that book is still, probably should be on some of the bestseller lists. It's still used every year by every intro to sociocultural anthropology class that exists. Because this is how we understand how to do what we do. Because he documents not just his ethnography, that's fine, big deal. But he goes through all of his mistakes. He goes through the stuff he does wrong. He goes through the stuff where he really screws up. And lays out why it was a problem, what he could have done. And he really starts looking at the process of doing ethnography. What do you notice about the dates that he's in the Trobriand Islands? Any history majors in here? Any non-history majors that recognize those dates? World War I, exactly. What happens is he's only supposed to be there for a few months. He gets dropped off, and because of the war, he doesn't get off the island for 3 years. It actually forces him to do this really long stay, right? This is one of the first examples of an ethnography that's being done over this long a period of time. And so he's able to go layer after layer after layer that we don't see in any of these before and that we all strive for today. I may have mentioned before, I work a lot with a guy named Mark Arax. Mark Arax used to be an LA Times reporter. He's worked for the Fresno Bee. He's taught here. He's taught journalism here. But he's mostly known for writing both fiction and nonfiction books, mostly nonfiction, but he's also written a couple of novels. And he is the only other person who professionally researches the communities that I research. Some for books, some for articles, but so we often I'm often introducing him to people that I know. He's often introducing me to people that he knows. In other words, we're sharing our subjects. And he's a reporter. I'm an anthropologist. He shows up with this antique cassette recorder, one of those little things that hit, those little blocks that fit in your hand. You put a cassette in and you push the record button and it's got the microphone built in. And he'll walk up and go, "Hi, I'm Mark Arax from wherever he happens to be at the point. Mind if I ask you some questions?" And it goes boom, 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 boom. Asks a few questions, gets some answers, goes off, writes an article, sends it off to the California Sunday Magazine and gets his check. Done. I introduce myself. And I'm done, right? Because I'm going to be back maybe next week. I might be back in a month, might be back sometime, but I'm going to be back again and again and again. And at some point, I'll ask some questions. And at some point, I'll start trying to get people to trust me, right? But I know that if I go in and I'll get superficial answers. In fact, it always cracks up my peers, and they always get mad at me because I always tell my students, your subjects will lie to you, always. There's no way around it. They will tell you what they're comfortable telling you or what they think you want to hear. And this is why, this is the importance of the long duration, whether it's in one big block or whether it's in multiple blocks, is that over time, you ask the same question different ways. And eventually you start getting to the actual answers. I'll give you an example of how the questioning can basically backfire on you in a little bit, if I remember to do it. So Malinowski is really credited with really defining this whole big thing that we call participatory observation or ethnographic method, the ethnographic method. And one of the things that he says in the notes, the field notes, or not the field notes, but the reflections, is that part of our process, part of our goal in doing ethnography is that we want to capture our subject's point of view. Until we're 4 years old, each of us believes we are the center of the universe. Some of us outgrow it. Some of them become president. But most of us don't, most of us do eventually outgrow it. But each of us views the world based on our experiences. We each view the world a little differently. And that is magnified when you're talking about different cultures. If you don't have a word for something, does it exist? Right? If you don't have the concept, is it real? Right? And so there are lots and lots of examples. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to see whatever world it is you're observing through the eyes of the people who are in that world. That's one reason why you're participating, one reason why you're observing while doing it. You're becoming part. And there are two primary points of view. We'll talk about that in just a bit, but I want to prepare you for this. So Malinowski starts out the reflections on the day he gets dropped off. He says, imagine yourself suddenly set down, surrounded by all your gear, alone on a tropical beach close to a native village, while the launch or dinghy which has brought you sails away out of sight. Imagine further that you are a beginner without previous experience, with nothing to guide you and no one to help you. And I guess if you're the guy that's going to basically invent the ethnographic method, you're kind of going to be a blank slate, right? This is actually what allows him to develop the techniques that we still use. For the white man is temporarily absent. And the reason this is, again, this is 1915, I'm sorry. This is 1915. And he doesn't speak the language of the islanders. He only speaks English. And the few people that he can communicate aren't in the village. They're off in stuff that's been built specifically for them. And they think he's crazy that he wants to go off into these. Why do you want to go live with the villagers? Come live with us. It's nice over here. We got ice. We got air conditioning, right? No, I want to. So they figure he's crazy and leave him alone. This exactly describes my first initiation into field work on the south coast of New Guinea. And so Malinowski lands, his gear's taken off the boat, it's piled up on the dock, he's left there, the boat goes away, and he gets stranded for 3 years. And as I said, he has no pre-existing knowledge or understanding as to how to do this field work. So he begins to piece it together. One of the first things that he decides to do is he's going to find a key informant. Someone who can be a broker between him and the community. This is one way that we still use for gaining entree into a community that we're not already a member of. Is to find someone within that group that knows about the group, that speaks the language, that grew up in the traditions of that group, and can be a cultural broker, can introduce you to people, can explain things. Problem with the key informant, though, is that oftentimes it's a person on the fringes. It's unlikely in many situations that the people who are going to be willing to let you into that world are the people that are running that world, or the people that have positions of power or status. It's usually someone on the edges. Maybe something, for example, the community may be very anti-gay, and you've got the one homosexual in the village. He's willing to talk to you, nobody else is. So that's the person you go to because you can at least get information from them. The same, it could be a variety of things. Very often it's someone who's moved away, learned the language that you speak, come back, but never fully embraced into the community when he came back, or she came back. So there give you a lot of reasons why that key informant may be a liminal subject in the community, but it's a start. In fact, this is exactly what happens with Malinowski. His first key informant is useful to a point. And then he reaches the point where he has to actually substitute other key informants, where working with the initial key informant is actually getting in the way. And one of the ways that can happen is that because you're working so closely with that key informant and asking very specific questions about the society that you're observing, trying to figure out what the meaning, because that's your point. You're trying to find the meaning from their point of view. And so you interrogate your key informant about various things that you see. You try to get to the problem is that you are now changing the key informant, right? The questions you ask may change the way that he or she views their own community, in which case they then become far less useful as a key informant because there's a break there. There's a separation that doesn't work because now they're not viewing it solely as a member of that community. So you have to be very careful when dealing with the key informants, and what's perfect is when you have several, when you have different people that you can rely on, that you can contact. So basically, these are kind of the steps that we take. Grab that. I'll come down. There we go. I'm going to go back up. It's easier. So the first thing you want to do is you want to get rapport. And I think, did I talk to you about my worst case of trying to get entree? Did I talk to you about Timothy Cooksey and getting the consent form? I think I did that. Didn't I talk about that? Have I talked about it? Yeah, he's saying yes, so he's to blame if I didn't. But so you can see that it may be quite difficult to gain entree. The trust that you have to build is you have to become one of the family. You have to become one of the community. And so the first thing you have to do is become accepted and establish that rapport, which you have to work at every single time you're around your subjects. In order to truly do ethnography, we're talking long periods of time. And they can be done in different ways. Not everybody goes and lives in the community that they're studying, especially if they have, like for example, mine is a multi-sited study. So which one would I live in? I've got over 24, almost 30 communities that I look at. I can't live in all of them. I happen to live close to all of them, but I can't live in any of them. I was lucky. I didn't have to learn another language. My Spanish, my piss poor Spanish is sufficient to get by for the population that's there now. But the majority of the people that I'm interviewing are African Americans. They don't speak anything but English. And so I don't really have a language issue. But you may when you're going out into the field. You guys won't. But if you were going to do this for a living, your study may be someplace where you have to learn the language. Or at least in your case, in almost every one of you, this is the applied anthro class, so each one of you, there are certain terms that are used within your industry that you need to know so that when they're being thrown around by the people that you're observing, you know what they're talking about because they're speaking in code. Customs, behaviors, norms, cultural rules, you go, well, that's easy. What I'm looking at is right here in the United States. Even the difference between two lawyers' offices, they're going to have different customs. They're going to have different norms. They're going to have a different environment, a different culture. Every time you've got a group of people that are in close proximity with each other for extended periods of time, a culture will develop. And it can be very different. You can have two offices side by side in the same office building. And they would have completely different cultures within those two businesses. Your job the whole time that you're participating and observing is to gather information. And you do that by participation. You do that through observation. You do that through interviews, life stories, or oral history interviews where you get everybody's whole life and piece it together and then triangulate between different interviews. You would gather it through archival sources. Right? Old newspapers, old video. You might have done some video. You might have done some photographs. Back those up. There is any method you can think of to collect information is valid because we use it all. And you don't want to just gather data on narrowly focused things, right? You go, oh, I'm just observing the people. But where are they meeting? What are they standing? Are they sitting? Is it in a building? Is it in the middle of a field? If it's in a building, is it a new building, an old building? Is it clean? Is it old but well kept? Is it new but trashy? Because all of that leads into the culture. What did the parking lot look like? What are the cars in the parking lot? Were they all beat up old junkers or were they all brand new Benzes? Right? All of this stuff is important. There's nothing that you're going to see when you go to do your observation that isn't important. Problem is you got to edit that list, right? You got to go through all that stuff in your head to say, what is it that's important? You may not know. And so that's why your field notes should be extremely inclusive. The carpet's brown, a few worn spots here and there, generally clean. There was one stain in the corner, right? Is that important? Who knows? But it's part of your observation. So you want to gather all kinds of data. You take your field notes. And as part of your field notes, you should also be looking at yourself. What do you think it means? How does this make you feel? How do you think this fits into the rest of what you're doing? Do you think that what you did was successful, or do you need to modify it and try something different next time? Because those, like I said, I've never read the ethnography of the Trobriand Islanders from 1915 to 1918. I don't care. And it's not an area I study. But his thoughts, his reflections on field work, I got portions of that book memorized. I've had to read it so many times. I've been reading that book since the 1970s. I've read it in multiple classes. I've read it on my own because it's how we do it. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Young Frankenstein. There's a part where he goes downstairs and he finds in the dungeon, he finds this big book, and on the top it says, How I Did It. That's Malinowski, right? How I Did It is Frankenstein's How I Did It book. And so we rely a lot on him. So she blows it, right? She starts off completely on the wrong foot. So where is the first mistake that she makes?
Was it reading and expecting the truth to say?
You almost have exactly the right answer. She's done a lot of her pre-research, which is crucial. And from that, she has formed a research question. Right? What was her question? It was something about, she wanted to know about hobos and somebody else sleeping rough in the park. Well, so she's making an assumption, right? She says, this is what I want to study. And then she goes down to the park and she invites a couple of her subjects back to her office, gives them a hamburger, they eat and leave. Fuck. Right? Well, that's not working. So she says, well, before you go, can you fill out my survey? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. It's not clear whether they do it or not. And they go away. Well, how is she participating or observing, right? But even more important than the fact that she's kind of taking them out of their environment, right? That's the first thing, is she's taking them out of her environment, or their environment, and putting it in hers. Well, that's not going to make them feel natural and comfortable, right? And then she feeds them, and they disappear. Then she asks them to do the survey, but what does she learn? Her first mistake wasn't just that she invited them up to the office. It was that she had a predetermined question. Because were those hobos and homeless sleeping in the park? So were those homeless or hobos sleeping in the park? No, they weren't. So her initial research question was completely flawed. She wants to go look at something that doesn't exist. Right? This is why we don't usually have these really tight hypotheses when we start a study. Sometimes we're a little more specific, but most of the time it's like, let's go view this community. And then out of what we observe, we can start asking questions, but we've got to see the reality on the ground first, right? So she finally does that. She finally goes down and talks to them, and they go, look, we're all office workers, right? The people that she's labeling as hobos and homeless are people working in the offices around the park. And they go out, they have their lunch, then they take a 30-minute siesta on the lawn, right? It's not even where she started in the very first place. But it wasn't until she went down and asked them what they were doing, and they explained it, and then she went, oh, I'll take a nap, right? And then she begins participating, and so within a few years, she's then actually able to write her ethnography. It has nothing to do with hobos, it has nothing to do with homeless. It's about people taking naps in the park after lunch, right? Sometimes we make these assumptions. Like some of you on your observations were really specific, and I said, roll it back. Some of you weren't specific enough, and I said, make it a little tighter. But basically, you're kind of coming along. So now, I include this slide, and I always talk about it, but I want to make sure that we're very careful about this. Anthropology is a comparative study in that we do compare different aspects of different communities at different times to see how they're the same or how they're different. But that's after the ethnographies are done, right? Because you don't want to go in and do your observation with preconceived notions. You want to be prepared, but you don't want to say, oh, this is just like such and so, right? So our research question should never be a comparative question to start with. When you get ready, if you were going to be an anthropologist when you grew up instead of whatever it is you're going to be, and you were planning your research, you would begin very broadly, and then as you acquire the information, that's when you can start bringing in the comparisons and things like that. But it should never be part of your actual question, your initial research question. This one you don't have to read. This one has actually got people talking in it.
Today's lesson on emic and etic approaches to studying human culture will be both complicated and simple. It'll be complicated because the terms emic and etic are unfamiliar to most of us. However, it'll be simple because despite the way they sound, the emic and etic approaches to studying culture are rather easy to understand. With that confidence builder of sorts, let's get started. As already stated, the words emic and etic signify two different approaches used to study human cultures. However, like many of the terms used in anthropology, the study of humankind, the definition of these terms can tend to vary. For this reason, we'll keep our definitions a bit more general. Once we have our terms down, we'll then take some time and nail down some examples. However, as we do this, it'll be important for us to remember that although the terms are pretty much opposites, most modern research tends to be a blending of the two. With this in mind, we'll get going with the emic approach. The emic approach to studying human culture is one in which the members of the culture being studied are the main source of information used to understand the culture. More simply stated, it's when the words and beliefs of the culture's members take center stage. Rather than reading other scientists' accounts of the culture, the researcher will observe, even interview the members of the culture in order to understand why they live and believe as they do. Adding to this, researchers using the emic approach seek to start with almost a blank slate. In other words, they try to put away their preconceived notions about what culture should look like and simply learn from the cultures they are observing. For example, when a Western researcher observes a young tribesman being branded with the tribe's markings, they do not simply write it off as barbaric or torture. Instead, they try to look at it through the lens of the culture. Stated plainly, they try to get inside the head of the young man, realizing that to him it symbolized acceptance and manhood. For this reason, the emic approach is often called the insider approach. Many researchers believe this is the best approach when studying previously unstudied or newly discovered people groups. For ease in remembering, I like to link the M in emic to the idea that the actual members of a culture are the most important source of information when studying that culture. Opposite of the emic approach, the etic approach to studying human culture employs existing theories and perspectives that originated from outside the culture being studied. In other words, it uses preconceived notions and theories about culture in general in order to study specific cultures. For this reason, it's often referred to as the outsider approach. Like I link the M in emic to the word members, I like to link the T in etic to the word theories, as this approach has at its foundation the use of pre-existing theories. Using the above example of a young tribesman being branded, a researcher using the etic approach might look at the scene through the lens of what earlier anthropologists have reported about masculinity among different culture groups. Without ever interviewing the young man or any of his tribesmen, they would theorize on the meaning of the ritual by comparing it to similar rituals in other cultures. In fact, researchers who employ this method argue that it makes them more able to identify cultural traits that exist cross-culturally. However, opponents of this approach argue that this outside observation can tend to lead to mistaken conclusions and generalizations about specific cultures. With these two terms now defined, let's take a little quiz of sorts to see how we're doing. Here's what it's going to look like. I'll give an example, and then you'll have a few seconds to decide whether the approach being described is emic or etic. Before we get started, here's another quick review. The emic approach to studying human culture is one in which the members of the culture being studied are the main source of information used to understand the culture. To remember this one, I focus on the M in emic and members. Conversely, the etic approach employs existing theories and perspectives that originated from outside the culture being studied. To make this one stick, I use the T in etic and the T in the word theory to keep it straight. Okay, here we go. A researcher interviews a young woman living in a traditional Indian village in order to understand Hinduism's view on gender roles. Is this an emic or etic approach? If you said emic, you're correct. The researcher is using a member of the culture to understand the culture. Well done. Here's another one. A young researcher uses the theories of the famous anthropologist Franz Boas to explain why an African tribesman has 3 wives. If you said etic, you got it. The researcher is using a pre-existing theory in order to explain a culture. Well done. Okay, one more. A team of researchers come across an undiscovered tribe in the heart of the Amazon. The researchers spend years among the tribe, learning the language and developing theories about how the harsh environment of the Amazon has affected the tribe. Again, if you said emic, you are correct. Although the researchers spent years studying the tribe and developing theories about them, the main source of information for their work was still the members of the tribe. Good job. Anthropology is the study of humankind. In it, the terms emic and etic signify two different approaches to studying human culture. The emic approach to studying human culture focuses on the members of the culture being studied. Their words, perceptions, and beliefs are the main sources of information used to understand the culture. For this reason, the emic approach is often referred to as the insider approach. Unlike the emic approach, the etic approach uses existing theories and perspectives that originated from outside the culture being studied. Often used to identify areas of culture that span across people groups, the etic approach is often referred to as the outsider approach to studying culture. Well done.
All right. Now, there's also in more recently, we slight nuance on the terms etic and emic. That is exactly the definition, but we also use emic very often if the researcher is originally part of that community. In other words, the researcher is inside, and in that case, you just take the E and the M and flip it backwards, and it's the me, right? So if you want to try to remember that. So the insider's view is the insider's view, and the etic is the outsider's view. So let's look at some examples and how this can play out over time. So one of the most famous anthropologists of all time, one of the ones to first write for the public, for the general press, the public press, not just for other academics, was Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead was one of Franz Boas's grad students at Columbia, worked closely with Ruth Benedict. And she made her name in the 1920s writing a book called Coming of Age of Samoa, which is her ethnography of her field work. And what she wanted to do is she understood that in Western societies, that when the hormones kick in, teenagers go into rebellion mode. Whatever their parents said, forget that, I know better, right? Yeah, eventually you realize your parents are pretty cool. But at the beginning, your dad, you're ruining my life, right? We all go through that. And she wants to see if that is biological or whether it is determined by culture. So she looks for a culture that is as non-Western as you can get. And she finds Samoa, which has not been really brought into the 20th century at all. It's still traditional village life generally, still traditional religion, still traditional practices. And she goes and she studies young women. And she finds that the young women in Samoa some of them have pretty active sex lives. And they're pretty open and they have pretty healthy attitudes toward sex. They don't have the same rebellion that American adolescents have. They're very different. And so she, through her work, comes up with the concept and solidifies the concept of cultural determination. That it is culture, right? And we've talked a little bit about this before. We talked about the concept of habitus, right? You begin to learn your culture on your mother's knee. And then within the family, and then the extended family, and then, keep going. School, church, synagogue, wider community, mass media, all of these feed in. That's how you acquire culture. And so she was able to show that it isn't biology that's triggering these girls' reactions, and she talks a lot about what they do. And it really is, it's still in print. It's never been out of print. But in the 1980s, we get this dude with the stupid hats. And I don't know what the stupid hats are all about, but he wears them all the time. His name's Derek Freeman, and he writes a book called Margaret Mead and Samoa, The Making and Unmaking of an Anthropological Myth. And he says, you know what? She was either the victim of a hoax or she completely fucked up. She completely blew it. She had no clue what she was doing. And so Freeman goes to Samoa in the 1980s and interviews a whole bunch of the elders of the villages, a bunch of the men, old men, 60 years after, well, 55 years after Margaret Mead left. And those men tell him, oh, no, our women were never like that. They were all, they've always been good girls. We never, that was never, our culture was never like that. And so Freeman comes back and writes this book, Trashing Margaret Mead. Anybody see any potential problems with Freeman's basic approach to this? I'm sorry, what? He studied the wrong people. He asked old men instead of young girls. That's number one. What about the temporal aspects of it? It was a long time. Do you think that maybe Samoa has changed since Margaret Mead was there? What do you think are some of the changes that have happened that would be germane to understanding the differences in your approach? What do you think some of the changes are? Well, how about the arrival of missionaries, for one, and the abandonment of traditional culture, technology, radio, television, right? They're no longer living a traditional culture. They're living just like you, or more like you than they were before. And their morals and their ethics and their whole worldview is different than it was when she was there. This is why the moment an ethnography is done, it's time to go back and do another one, right? Because communities change. That's the rules. Things change over time. So the passage of time, the fact that culture had changed. Mead was a young woman interviewing young women. Freeman was an old man asking about women's practices in the past. All of the stuff that Margaret Mead did was very, very private. She interviewed these girls in private. She wrote the stuff up. It wasn't being proclaimed in front of the village. Freeman met a lot of these men in large groups. Also very different at the way that they approach it. And I've mentioned this before. In most disciplines, you just write you just tell the story. And that's what we are. We're storytellers. But anthropologists, as opposed to historians, and I have to write for both disciplines because I'm in both disciplines. But in history, you just start writing. Your theoretical foundation comes through by how you choose your subjects and how you write. Anthropology, we use so many different theories. We come from so many different backgrounds that we normally, when we're writing for publication, the first quarter to third of every paper is our foundation, our theoretical foundation, so we understand how we're approaching, right? Understand the point of view before you get into the details. Now, you're not going to be required to do that on any of your papers. I'm just giving you the background. So she is looking at it from the standpoint of cultural determination. It was the society that predicted the behavior of the women. Freeman wants to prove that it is biology, and therefore that would be what would predict the behavior. Doesn't work so well. However, 2009, we get Paul Shankman. Paul Shankman comes up with the Trashing of Margaret Mead, Anatomy of an Anthropological Controversy. And he goes back and he looks at it, goes back, goes through her field notes, goes through his stuff, and he goes, no, wait. And all of those things that we just talked about, he points out this is why they may both be right. Freeman a little less than Mead, but what Freeman saw in 1983 was what Freeman saw in 1983. It had nothing to do with what Mead saw in 1928, right? And so it comes around full circle again. Now, again, a lot of these lectures are just terms, right? So we do two types of field work as far as the temporal dimension, the stuff dealing with time. The first we refer to as synchronic, and this is like what Malinowski did, right? Get stranded for 3 years. You're there, you spend the whole time there, you live there the whole time, and then you come out and you write your ethnography. The diachronic is more what I do, right? As I said, I have almost 30 different communities that I work in. I can't live in any or all of them. And so I go in, I spend time, I come back out. I go back in a week later, weeks later, months later, maybe sometimes years later because I can't get around to all of them on a regular basis. And it's an ongoing process. Now, I will be sending out later today an extra credit assignment for this weekend where you have an opportunity to go with me into the field where I will give you a form with some very broad questions, and you need to, you would be observing what goes on, you document what you see, and then you give me that form, and I put it with the 10 years worth of forms with the same questions that I have, and it's material that I've been collecting on just this one event that happens on a regular basis. Oh, and you get to play bingo while you're there if you want to. Right? I mean, because that's where field work is done. The field work is done where your community is, and there happens to be a bingo thing in the community one of the communities I work in this weekend, and it's a great place to go and observe the community writ large, their interaction with other people, their interactions among themselves. So, so you'll be able to actually, if you wish, come get some extra credit, come and help me with my research, but you get an opportunity to actually get your feet wet a little bit. We're getting close. So in the last few years, and probably since the 60s, anthropologists have kind of just realized that it's not just the other, it's not just the unusual, it's not just the exotic that we need to study. That we can study anything, and that's why this class exists. Applied or engaged anthropology, as it's called in Europe, really is a relatively new subfield. But it comes out of the fact that we realized that every culture can be studied. Every society can be studied, whether it's the society or the culture in a doctor's office or whether it's an entire country. Right? All of that can be examined anthropologically and understood and maybe make improvements or at least understand what's going on. And so we now no longer just look at the other, at the exotic. That extension of the emic view to me studying my own society, my own culture, is one of the more recent additions. We also are defining new worlds. Several years ago, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, my son presented a paper at the Southwest Anthropological Association. He was on a panel with 2 other people, and his paper was about the creepypasta community, an online community where they write short horror stories, share them. They've been doing this for years and years and years. Some people do illustrations, some people write plays, sometimes they'll get together and do old radio shows, but it's all about horror and short stories and sharing around the world. And he spent months figuring out the structure of the community, because there's several websites that are involved, and there are moderators here, and there are people that contribute here, and there are artists over here, and there are musicians here. There's all of this, and then there are people that just lurk, and there's all of this stuff. He gave a wonderful paper. But that year, 5 years, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, trying to put together the panel, we were only able to come up with 2 other people for his panel, one of whom, for the life of me, I'm trying to remember what it was. It was something internet related. The other one was doing a kind of a piss poor paper on furries, right? That was the closest we could get to looking at internet. Oh, it was the next year? Okay, well, it was 4 people, but it was very limited. The story was better the way I told it. Well, more or less, however I remember. Anyway, but we had trouble that first year getting a full panel for him that was related to the internet. Last year, we had 5 separate panels, all dealing with 4 or 5 people on each of those panels, dealing with internet communities, right? So as the world changes, new communities are formed. And they don't necessarily conform to our old, I mean, I have a student that was a student of mine and took Ethnographic Methods from me at the UC. And his proposal, which he's now working on in grad school, was to look at female gamers in the online community, right? Online games tend to be, well, video games tend to be very male-oriented. They got lots of TNA in there, right? Bouncing boobs and asses put into the camera at every opportunity. But there are women that like to play those games. Now, when they play them online, do they pretend they're a guy? How are they treated, right? All of this stuff. There's a whole community there to look at. You have to be willing to reimagine the world, and that's what anthropologists have been doing the last few years. I want to jump back real quick to the homeless sleeping in the park thing that we talked about earlier. Normally I add this little bit to help explain it. Then I forgot. I don't know why. So I don't think it was that year, but one year in my ethnography class, I had a student, and that class is set up so that they actually do the entire design of a research project without actually doing it. They do one interview, one observation, and that's it. But the rest of it, from the research question to filling out the IRB, doing all the ethics stuff, they do the entire project. And then they take the whole semester to do that and then turn it in at the end. And so early in the semester, I get the question, just like you turned in your observation proposals. So I get their research question. And this one lady, her question was, I want to know why homeless people want to be homeless. So office hours comes around and she's in and I'm like, well, what makes you think people want to be homeless? She's like, well, I mean, there are all these programs and there's welfare and there's disability and you know, some of them have mental health problems or drug problems. They could probably get covered by this and that. And she goes on and on. I said, have you ever talked to a homeless person? She went, no. I said, have you ever talked to anybody who works with the homeless? She said, no. So I made her go interview a caseworker. I made her go out and interview a homeless person. She came back in, completely changed her question, and she's now in grad school doing her research. It has nothing to do with people desiring, just like this one turned out it wasn't hobos sleeping in the park, it was people taking naps after lunch, right? And so the reason I normally tell that other story at the other point is because the two support each other.
The research shown in this video is called field research or ethnographic research. In this kind of study, the researcher, whose name is Maria, hangs out with and gets to know the members of the community she is trying to understand. In the scene you're about to watch, Maria has been spending several months with people in the neighborhood who use heroin and who have or are at risk of getting HIV. She is both talking with drug users about their sexual practices and observing their drug use to understand the conditions that lead them to share needles and drug injection equipment. In these types of studies, the researcher usually gets to know one or two drug users very well, and these drug users introduce the researcher to other drug users in the community. In this video, Maria is meeting with a drug user named Steve. Steve agreed to be in the study 2 months ago. Since then, he has introduced Maria to a lot of people he uses drugs with for the study. As you watch the video, think about what problems the current situation is making for both Steve and Maria, how they are both feeling, and what should be done.
Hey, Maria. What'd you bring me today?
The usual, the sandwich and a coffee.
Oh, great. I'm starved.
Steve, I'm so glad you've introduced me to so many people in the neighborhood. It's really helped me to find people to interview for my research.
Yeah. Well, Chris told me about the interview you did yesterday. And how are you going to do another one tomorrow? You know, I've been going out with Chris for about a month now. What did Chris tell you about me?
You know I can't tell you the things that people tell me, unless they're planning to hurt you. I can't even tell Chris the things you've told me.
Good. Because I wouldn't want Chris to know I'm HIV positive.
You mean Chris doesn't know?
No. Chris is negative and we don't use protection.
I wish you hadn't told me this. Now I have a problem. Remember I told you that if I found out that you might be able to hurt someone, I'd have to tell them?
No, I don't remember that.
Well, when we first met 2 months ago, you signed a consent form that said that I might have to let someone know if I knew you were planning to hurt them. I thought you understood.
Yeah, well, I was probably high and I needed the money you were talking about. Anyway, I wouldn't hurt Chris.
Yeah, but you could still infect Chris with HIV. Doesn't Chris have a right to know that?
Anyway, I know people who have sex with people who are positive who never get HIV.
You're still taking a big risk. You should say something to Chris, or I could tell...
No way. I gave you permission to write down stuff I talk about, not to ruin my sex life. If you told Chris, it'd be over, and I couldn't handle that. Can we just finish up the questions you have, talk about Chris later? What other questions you have, Marie, for me?
Okay, let's get the usual questions out the way. When was the last time you got high?
Well, actually, it's been hours, and I'm really kind of freaking out. I might not even be able to finish this interview. I really need a fix now, and I don't have any money. Hey, I got an idea. You know how you usually pay me after we meet? Well, why don't you give me some of the money in advance, and I can go get it fixed now? Yeah, you give me half the money right now, and I can go get my stuff, and I can come back and finish answering your questions, and then get the rest of the money. As long as I get some of the money right now. Come on. We're friends, right?
I don't know.